Rory McIlroy arrived at Augusta National in 2026 looking like something golf hadn't seen in years. Not just a favorite, but an inevitability. The swing was effortless, the putting stroke was automatic, and by the time the weekend arrived, the leaderboard didn't feel like a competition anymore. It felt like a formality. A 6-shot lead at the Masters isn't just control, it's domination. It's the kind of margin that turns the back nine on Sunday into a victory lap. But this didn't feel like a normal takeover. It felt too clean, too precise, almost like the outcome had already been decided before the final round even began. And that's when people started to look closer. Because before the green jacket was even within reach, something else was already spreading through the fairways and the media tents. Not accusations, not headlines, just whispers. Quiet conversations between players, subtle questions from analysts. How prepared was McIlroy really? How much time had he spent figuring out Augusta before anyone else arrived? And more importantly, was he operating under the same conditions as the rest of the field? Nothing illegal, nothing provable. But in a sport built on tradition and integrity, even the suggestion of an uneven playing field carries weight, and this one wasn't going away. Here's where it gets complicated. Because no rules were broken, no penalties were issued. In fact, many players publicly dismissed the idea entirely, saying the access McIlroy had wasn't exclusive. It was just utilized better. But that didn't silence the conversation. If anything, it amplified it. Because now the question wasn't whether he cheated. The question was whether he had found a way to bend the system without technically breaking it. And in a sport where perception matters just as much as performance, that distinction is razor thin. And dangerously powerful. Rory McIlroy didn't just dominate Augusta, he divided it. The deeper you look into Augusta 2026, the less this story feels like a simple victory, and the more it starts to resemble a system being quietly mastered. Because behind Rory McIlroy's dominance was something far less visible than a perfect swing. It was preparation, not just standard practice rounds, not just showing up early. We're talking about calculated familiarity, extra time, extra reps, a level of comfort on Augusta's greens that didn't look learned in a single week. Reports began to surface that McIlroy had spent significantly more time understanding the course conditions before the tournament window officially tightened. Again, nothing hidden, nothing illegal, but in a tournament where knowledge of every slope, every break, every invisible ridge can decide everything. And even a small edge starts to feel massive. And that's where the conversation turned. Naturally, the golf world responded. Other professionals were quick to shut down any talk of cheating. Some even laughed it off. The message was consistent. Anyone could have done it. The access wasn't exclusive. The opportunity wasn't secret. If you had the connections, the time, the resources, you could prepare the same way. And on paper, that should have ended the discussion right there, because golf has always rewarded preparation. It has always been a sport of details. But something about this felt different, because while everyone could have done it, not everyone did. And that gap between possibility and execution is exactly where perception starts to take over. And perception doesn't play by the rules. So now the question shifts. Not did he cheat, but something far more uncomfortable. If a player gains an advantage within the rules, but beyond what most competitors realistically access, is the competition still equal? Is it still pure, or are we watching two different versions of the same tournament unfold at the same time? One played on the surface, broadcast to millions, and another played behind the scenes where preparation becomes separation. That's the line Augusta 2026 started to blur, because this wasn't about breaking the system, it was about understanding it better than anyone else, and maybe pushing it further than anyone expected. No rules were broken, but the line between preparation and privilege started to blur. For 3 days at Augusta, Rory McIlroy looked like he was playing a different sport. Every drive found the fairway. Every approach settled inside birdie range. A 6-shot lead at the Masters doesn't just happen. It's built shot by shot, mistake by mistake from everyone else. By Sunday morning, the tournament felt over. Commentators were already shifting from if to when. The green jacket wasn't being contested, it was being reserved. And then, without warning, the entire structure of that dominance began to crack, and nobody saw it coming. It started subtly, a missed putt here, a slightly off approach there. But at Augusta, momentum doesn't fade. It flips. What was once automatic suddenly felt uncertain. The 6-shot cushion shrank. Then it vanished. The leaderboard tightened, and for the first time all week, McIlroy looked human, not composed, not inevitable, just another player trying to hold it together under Sunday pressure. Fans watching around the world weren't just surprised, they were confused. How does someone that dominant lose control that quickly? And more importantly, what changed? But here's where the story takes its sharpest turn, because just as quickly as it unraveled, it reversed. McIlroy stabilized, regained control, found the shots when it mattered most, and somehow, almost impossibly, he still won. From collapse to recovery to victory. It didn't feel like a smooth performance. It felt chaotic, disjointed, almost like two completely different tournaments had been stitched together into one. And that emotional whiplash didn't sit right with everyone watching because it raised more questions than it answered. Even the broadcast added to the confusion. Key moments were missed. Critical shots weren't shown clearly. Fans flooded social media, frustrated that the defining swings of the tournament felt obscured. In a moment that should have been crystal clear, everything felt strangely incomplete. And when clarity disappears in a sport built on precision, doubt fills the space. He went from unstoppable to unraveling to champion, all in a matter of hours. By the time the dust began to settle at Augusta, the conversation around Rory McIlroy had already moved beyond birdies and bogeys. Because this wasn't just about how he won anymore, it was about everything surrounding it. And for those paying attention, a pattern started to emerge. Not in his swing, not in his strategy, but in how the rules seemed to apply to him now compared to just a few seasons ago. Because this version of McIlroy wasn't playing under the same consequences as the one we saw before. And that shift didn't go unnoticed. Rewind the clock. Not long ago, McIlroy made headlines for skipping key PGA Tour events. The decision cost him millions in fines, bonuses, and eligibility penalties. It was framed as a firm stance by the tour. Commitment matters. Show up or pay the price. And McIlroy did. Publicly. Financially. It was a moment that reinforced the idea that no player, no matter how big, was above the system. But fast forward to 2026, and something feels different. The same type of scheduling decisions no longer carry the same consequences. The penalties adjusted. The rules evolved. And suddenly the cost of skipping isn't what it used to be. And people started asking why. Now, to be clear, this isn't about broken rules. Everything McIlroy has done sits within the updated framework of the tour. But that's exactly where the tension lives. Because when the framework changes in a way that benefits the same player who once suffered under it, the optics become impossible to ignore. Critics began to question whether this was coincidence or convenience, whether the system had evolved naturally or selectively. And in a sport that prides itself on fairness, even the appearance of inconsistency can be enough to fracture trust. And that fracture was growing. So now the narrative shifts again. This isn't just about Augusta. It's about integrity, about consistency, about whether the same standards apply across time or only when it's convenient. Because the same decisions that once cost him everything suddenly cost him nothing.